Hello, my name is Sven-Amin Lembke. I'm a senior lecturer at De Montfort University in Leicester, UK, and conduct my research at the MTI² Institute of Sonic Creativity. I'll be presenting work on a perceptual experiment in which listeners matched unidirectional auditory gestures to visual trajectories that varied in curvature. Most of us will be familiar with this animation classic, where Wile E. Coyote's imminent fate becomes audible through the following sound gesture. We can thus define a gesture as conveying a spatiokinetic process by the way of analogy. With regard to the property of gestures, we will distinguish the following. First, the auditory parameter along which it takes place, such as pitch or timbral brightness, as in the previous example, or also loudness or tempo. Next, there is the mapping of the parameter, which likely relies on cross-modal correspondences. The correspondence used here concerns pitch to elevation. High pitch maps to the top of the cliff, whereas low pitch points towards the bottom of the canyon. As such, unidirectional pitch gestures may go either way. The orientation becomes important when one seeks to convey a certain meaning. I refer to the meaning or signification of a gesture as its category. Decreasing pitch from high to low here signifies a physical downward motion, in other words, a fall. In the last decade, there have been studies on how sound gestures are perceived and also expressed, employing time-variant measures like sound tracings or motion capture. These studies confirmed the aforementioned properties, but also evaluated how what I call gesture magnitude is expressed along the parameter. For instance, a fall by 2 octaves as opposed to 1 will evoke a larger gestural magnitude. Likewise, I would argue that also the duration of a gesture may affect magnitude. We therefore know what a gesture signifies, when and where it starts and ends, but not how we get from the start to the end, and how the gesture actually takes place across time. Does the fall occur along a parabolic trajectory, or does the descent go about linearly? Should the fall sound like this? Or would this be a better match? These varying degrees of curvature represent what I call gestural shape. This gestural property has not been studied in detail, which motivated the current investigation. In music and audio applications, gestural shape finds the following uses. For pitch or brightness gestures, frequency scaling becomes important, where spectrotemporal representations allow for manipulations and annotations, importantly bearing clear perceptual consequences. The E-analysis software, for instance, allows spectromorphological annotations using sound shapes or gestures directly onto spectrograms. In terms of loudness gestures, waveform editing involves manipulations of amplitude, as in applying fade-ins or fade-outs to audio clips. Common audio software like Pro Tools or Reaper have a standardized set of fade functions spanning different curvature types, ranging from logarithmic, linear, exponential, and so-called S-curves. To investigate the influence of physical scalings of frequency, amplitude, and time on the shape of auditory gestures, an experiment was conducted with the following aims: to explore matching unidirectional auditory gestures to visual analogs, to describe perceived gestural shape in terms of curvature, to contextualize shape to physical or psychophysical scales, and assess shape perception across a number of factors. 20 participants took part, including varying degrees of musicianship and listening expertise. Participants were tested individually in controlled conditions, where sounds were presented via a single loudspeaker. Across all parameters, stimuli were composed of bandpass filtered noise with constant relative bandwidth. For pitch gestures, the filter's center frequency varied over time. 4 independent variables were investigated, of which 3 are discussed on this slide. First, the orientation of gestures could either increase or decrease over time. The second factor comprised different ranges for a parameter's main physical correlate. For pitch, each range was 2 octaves wide relative to a central anchor of 1 kHz. For loudness, each range spanned 18 decibel below and above a reference sound pressure level of 64 dB SPL. For tempo, the tempo either halved or doubled relative to the reference of 360 BPM, where each beat corresponded to a short noise burst. The tempo ranges led to different gesture durations, which for pitch and loudness gestures represented an additional independent variable. The fourth independent variable concerned the underlying acoustic or physical function, which was expected to influence gestural shape. 4 functions for each parameter were considered, as shown here first for pitch. Functions could concern common scales of both physical or psychoacoustical relevance, like linear frequency along hertz or linear scale along equivalent rectangular bandwidth or ERB rate. In addition, exponential and logarithmic functions were also considered. For loudness gestures, all four options represent common control functions for fade-ins or fade-outs, namely linear amplitude, linear dB level, which is exponential along amplitude, thirdly, logarithmic amplitude, and the S-curve function. For tempo gestures, three functions involved different Q coefficients and a power-based dependency, while the fourth function depended on a squared inter-onset interval. Both dependencies had been studied in the context of tempo variation before. In the experiment, participants' task was to compare three of the acoustic functions in a single trial. Each could be played back independently, and participants had to match the perceived shape of the auditory gesture to a visual analog line segment of varying curvature, using a slider. A demonstration will follow on the next slide. Across trials, all possible triplet contexts of the four functions, here denoted A to D, were evaluated. The experiment comprised 80 trials in total, and gestures were blocked by a parameter and counterbalanced across participants. The following video illustrates two experimental trials for pitch gestures across varying orientation, frequency range, and duration. For greater clarity, we will now look at the results for pitch gestures before discussing the remaining parameters. Concerning the independent variable function, which was expected to convey differences along gestural shape, strong differences were indeed perceived, as analyzed by repeated measures ANOVA on the shape-related slider ratings. In terms of visual analogs, the underlying exponential and logarithmic functions assumed analogous shapes, while ERB rate, here in orange, and linear frequency scale in hertz, in blue, assumed intermediate degrees of curvature. ERB rate, the function denoted C, and in orange, matched the straight line most closely, where this function's perceived linearity may relate to it being a psychoacoustical function matching the scaling of auditory filters. Among the remaining independent variables, only frequency range introduced some mild variation between the lower and higher 2-octave wide frequency ranges. More specifically, gestural shape below 1 kHz was perceived as relatively more exponential compared to gestural shape being relatively more logarithmic at higher frequencies. Notably, the distinction between all four functions seemed unaffected, supported by the intervals of variation not overlapping. In addition, ERB rate even comprised the straight line, arguing that at least towards higher frequencies, its gestural shape was approximated as a straight line. A possible source of variation between frequency ranges could be related to a difference in perceived width of each range. Although both were equalized in terms of octave width, their corresponding widths along ERB rate differed by about a third. If ERB rate was thus perceptually more relevant here, it would have factored in as a measure of perceived gesture width or magnitude, and thus introduced a mediating effect on the evaluation of gestural shape. Moving on to loudness gestures, the following video demonstrates two trials varying along several factors. Loudness gestures also yielded clear differences in perceived gestural shape, although not as pronounced as for pitch gestures. Linear scale of amplitude almost matched the ideal straight line, whereas the S-curve function was similar in shape, but still distinguishable. Linear sound level in dB, by contrast, was matched to a clear exponential curvature, which resembles this function's trajectory along linear amplitude. Overall, auditory shape therefore seems to match the visual shape implied by a scaling of the raw amplitude, which is often the default representation in waveform editors. Although these relationships may be specific to the context A to D tested, it is notable that these same functions represent a set of common fade-in and fade-out options available in a variety of software applications. Unlike pitch gestures, a number of other independent variables became relevant. However, the most important finding concerned differences between the time orientation of gestures. The difference between increasing and decreasing gestures had a mediating influence on all remaining variables, in that the variables' duration and sound level range affected gestural shape more in decreasing gestures, which points towards a perceptual asymmetry. As shown in an interaction between gesture orientation and duration, gestural shape was more susceptible to vary across durations in decreasing loudness gestures. By contrast, as shown in the left panel, the lack of such a variation suggests that the perceptual distinction between gestural shapes was enhanced in increasing loudness gestures. This asymmetry resembles the greater importance and perceived magnitude for looming, that is, increasing loudness ramps, a phenomenon that has found a lot of attention in the psychoacoustical literature. Coming to our third and final parameter, this video illustrates a single condition for tempo gestures. Unlike pitch and loudness gestures, tempo gestures yielded issues concerning variation across the triplet context for the functions A to D. First, judgments only yielded weak differences in gestural shape, as shown on the right for the shape-related slider ratings, all being close to 0, that is, the central linear position. This weak resolution may have favored the observed contextual variations, which yielded violations of order. As illustrated here, the order between functions B and D were reversed across the highlighted contexts. These contextual violations did not warrant averages across contexts to be representative of the extrapolated relationships among all four functions, for which reason no further analysis and interpretation was possible. Notably, such contextual violations did not occur for the remaining parameters. In summary and conclusion, listeners of varying backgrounds were able to reliably and consistently distinguish shapes of both pitch and loudness gestures. Auditory shape could be associated to more linear, exponential, or logarithmic curvatures based on the underlying frequency or amplitude scalings. Furthermore, the perception of gestural shape seems fairly robust across a wider range of frequencies or sound levels and the two durations investigated, but it appears that shape perception may be affected by concurrent changes in gesture magnitude and may involve impaired perceptual distinction for certain time orientations, which in turn may apply differently to gesture categories or types. The shape of tempo gestures, by contrast, was unreliably distinguished, exhibiting weak distinctions among the functions and yielding inconsistent relationships across contexts. Although similar functions have been distinguished in note-based musical contexts, also using slower tempi, differences in the stimulus design may have made their distinction more difficult in the current experiment. In general terms, the current findings support the view that whereas the identity of sound gestures depends on the gesture category, more expressive potential can still be achieved by varying both the gesture magnitude and also the gesture shape. Visualization of sound gestures finds application widely, such as in sound design or data sonification. It is also widespread in electroacoustic music practices. In this context, a fundamental understanding of how visual shape relates to auditory shape is needed to reliably interpret and translate how visualized spectromorphologies will become audible. The final argument I'm trying to make is that whether a sound gesture is curved one way or another does indeed matter. And as illustrated here, this applies to both the aesthetic and creative decisions and the perspective of listeners. And that matching composers' intentions to listeners' reception needs to also consider gestural shape. Thank you for your attention, and I have to also expressly thank Abisola Sodimo for her help in recruiting participants and conducting the experiment.
Hello and welcome everyone to this presentation of Perception of Emotions in Knocking Sounds, an evaluation study. My name is Alfred Berg and I will present this study on behalf of Abhilash Arun, Alessandro Malcolm Houel, Adrián Barahona-Ríos, and Sandra Pauletto. Our primary goal with this study was to find out whether a person can recognize an intended emotion in knocking actions through sound alone. So, for instance, if somebody is knocking on your door, can you tell if this person is angry or sad or so on, just from listening to the knocking sounds? If this is possible, we also wanted to explore acoustic features that may allow us to identify different emotions. Now, why do we find this topic interesting? Well, sounds are important carriers of emotional content, and research has shown that there is a relationship between specific acoustic features and the emotions induced by, for example, speech and music. However, research on everyday sounds and emotions is much less extensive. We find knocking sounds interesting because when we knock, our aim isn't simply to make the person on the other side of the door aware of our presence. We often want to communicate a message, and in the way we knock, we set the emotional tone of the message. So knocking sounds serve to create expectations in people, which makes them a useful tool in storytelling media, like films and computer games, where these sounds can be used to create a sudden mood change or as a transition to a new scene. Finally, being able to identify acoustic correlates of emotions can contribute to the development of emotional processing tools for everyday sounds, and to inform new sonic interaction design, either for real-world contexts or for virtual media. For instance, for designing auditory interfaces or assessing the emotional impact of an environment. Our study includes two parallel tasks, a listening test and an acoustic analysis. The listening test was designed to answer our most fundamental question: can we identify the intended emotion of a knocking action through sound alone? Of course, we hypothesized that this is the case. For the second task, we chose 5 acoustic features that, on the basis of existing research, could play a part in our ability to recognize emotions through sound, and we analyzed how these features differed between each emotion. For the listening test, we asked 6 participants to record 20 short knocking actions for each of 4 basic emotions: anger, fear, happiness, and sadness, plus a neutral state. In the picture, you can see the recording setup. The participants specified an area on the door where they felt comfortable knocking, and the microphone was placed about 35 centimeters from this area. In order to generate emotionally loaded knocking actions, we instructed the participants to knock according to the scenarios that you can see in this table. And here is an example of a recording for the scenario meant to evoke anger and fear, happiness, sadness, and neutral. We chose to conduct the listening test online in order to reach as many participants as possible and to increase the ecological validity of the experiment, since the participants would be in a setting, for example their home or their office, where they might experience exactly the kind of knocking actions we presented to them. We anticipated that a long test would cause our participants to lose focus, so in order to keep the listening test within 10 to 15 minutes, 25 recordings were randomly selected for each emotion and each performer. This meant that the recordings of one participant were excluded for each emotion, and we ensured that the excluded performer wasn't always the same person. We also verified that the 25 recordings chosen for the listening test were representative of the whole dataset. Please refer to the article for more detail on this point. The knocking actions were presented in random order. After listening to a recording, participants were asked to select one of 5 emotions, which were presented as a horizontal line of radio buttons, with the order randomized for each knocking action. The test was completed by 98 participants. A chi-square test showed that overall there is a significant relationship between the intended emotions and perceived emotions. Additionally, we wanted to find out if participants could recognize each intended emotion, and this was the case for 3 emotions: anger, happiness, and sadness, as indicated by the table here. Fear, however, was often confused with anger, and neutral was confused with sadness. Regarding the former, 3 fear actions were perceived as anger more than 50% of the time, and we suggest that this might be due to our fear scenario, which evoked a panic-related fear that perhaps produced a reaction similar to anger. We also found that the neutral answer was selected almost 30% of the time. We think that participants may have used this as their go-to option when unsure about the other labels. Here we can see the 5 features we examined in our acoustic analysis. Action duration, number of knocks per action, and knocking rate are quite self-explanatory, but I will describe the last 2 in a little more detail. For knocking regularity, we measured the inter-onset intervals of an action and computed the coefficient of variation. So more irregular actions produce a higher coefficient. For the root mean square energy slope, we calculated the root mean square energy of each individual knock and applied a linear regression to each action. The slope of the fitted line determines if there is a crescendo or decrescendo in energy across the action. In the image, you can see that the slope is negative, signifying a decrescendo energy pattern for this particular knocking action. And here are the graphs associated with the acoustic analysis. They can all be found in the paper, but for the purpose of this presentation, we have summarized the most noteworthy results in the next slide. So overall, we found that anger was the most recognizable emotion, followed by sadness and happiness. Fear tended to be confused with anger, and neutral tended to be confused with sadness. Anger and fear actions present similar acoustic patterns, and as I mentioned earlier, we think that the way we articulated the fear scenario might have contributed to this result. Fear can be expressed in very different ways. It could, for example, be associated with panic, as was the case in our scenario, but it might also be associated with paralysis. So altering the fear scenario to something more akin to trepidation, for example, could produce very different results. The other 3 emotions did, however, display unique patterns of acoustic features. Comparing our results to other studies, we found that our results for rate, regularity, and root mean square energy slope were generally consistent with a previous study from Juslin and Lauka. In their paper, the authors reviewed 145 studies on vocal and musical expression and found that, quote, music performance uses largely the same emotion-specific patterns of acoustic cues as does vocal expression. The study also found that anger and sadness were generally communicated better than fear and happiness. Another study from Giordano, Egerman, and Bresin found strong similarities between the acoustic features exhibited by walking sounds with emotional intentions and music performance with similar emotions. The authors hypothesized that musical expression of emotions could have a motor origin, in other words, that we make use of our knowledge of expressive body movements when we communicate emotions through music, and our findings lend further support to this hypothesis. Finally, I'd like to share some thoughts on how this study may be extended. So first off, a more thorough acoustic analysis study would help to identify acoustic features in a more precise manner. Secondly, varying these scenarios could reveal important distinctions, for example, between different expressions of the same basic emotion. And finally, contextual factors might have a great impact on the expression and perception of knocking sounds, so further studies in this direction might lead to interesting results. So that's it for this presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for listening.
I am Rumi Hiraga of Tsukuba University of Technology. The co-author is Kjetil Falkenberg of KTH. This talk is our trial of using our own music game for hearing impaired people to see whether playing the music game improved their hearing ability. All of my students have hearing impairment. First, I will introduce them to you. Currently, I give them online classes. Since their communication way varies, I try to provide them as many communication methods as possible. I have to show them my face. A mask is not allowed. They look at my lips. Also, they want to see sign language. Caption is desirable. Some listen to my voice. At the same time, there are students who are addicted to listen to music. Even you put on hearing aids or cochlear implants, it never means you can listen to or understand sound all at once. The point here is the difference between hearing acuity, that is measured by audiogram, and hearing ability to understand sound. How profoundly deaf you are and not good at pronouncing words, you may be enthusiastic to music listening. With our experiences, we can say that music appreciation, perception, and enjoyment is not limited, nor restricted, nor impeded by hearing acuity. Since there are deaf and hard of hearing who want to listen to music, we wanted to let them enjoy music more by exposure to music. There are several ways to improve hearing ability of deaf and hard of hearing people. One is music therapy. In music therapy, music is provided as it is, not divided into elements such as melody. Therefore, music therapy is synthetic training. Currently, the purpose of music therapy session for deaf and hard of hearing people is mainly to improve speech-related ability. Good things in music therapy is music is chosen interactively and adaptively because therapists are on site. In other words, music therapy needs human resources, session appointments, and restriction in places. On the other hand, training with computer systems can be costless, less limitation in human resources, time, and place. There are computer-based auditory training. The purpose of computer-based auditory training is to improve speech recognition of deaf and hard of hearing people. Computer-based music training has the purpose of improving music understanding and music appreciation of deaf and hard of hearing people. Usually, computer-based music training focuses on elements of music like rhythm, timbre, and melody. This is analytic training. Therefore, many of the computer-based music training systems provide users monotonous training, like repeating melody contour discrimination. It is meaningless if trainees get to lose interest in music by training. We believe music training should be fun for deaf and hard of hearing people. Our computer-based music training with our music puzzle is a synthetic fun training. Music Puzzle is our own computer music game that uses the actual music and fun to play. We conducted an experiment of music puzzle with a group of deaf and hard of hearing people and groups of hearing people. We found a profoundly deaf person who could play music puzzle as well as hearing music experienced people. At that time, most of the deaf and hard of hearing participants showed that they liked to play music puzzle, and we found they concentrated on listening to music. So far as sound, material type of music puzzle can be anything. In the experiments, we used instrumental music, reading, and the mix of music and voice. Now we conducted another experiment using music puzzle to see whether active listening for playing music puzzle improves the hearing ability of deaf and hard of hearing people. Let's see how you play music puzzle. This is the procedure of the experiment. We asked the participants to play music puzzle for 4 weeks. In each week they at least played 5 days, and each day they played more than 30 minutes. So, they played 20 hours at least during the experiment. Every week, participants could play 12 sound material of the 3 types. In each week, we provided them different material so that the difficulty level increased by the number of sound fragments, the timbre and pitch modification. To see the effects of playing music puzzle, we executed listening tests 4 times. Before starting the experiment, after the 2 weeks of using music puzzle, after the 4 weeks of using music puzzle, and after 2 weeks of finishing using music puzzle. We asked 2 participants. One is a male student, P1, the other is a female student, P2. Because we needed to get the meaningful results, we could only ask reliable students to start the experiment. This is the reason of a small number of participants. This shows the assessment we used in the test, some of them based on our past experiments. We executed 6 types of tests because our training is a synthetic one and we did not think a specific music element recognition was improved. First, dictation. 2 Japanese reading, but 1 by male and 1 by female. It took about 5 seconds.
ワシントンスクエア西にある松竹は道路が狂ったように入り組んでおり、
Second, beat recognition by listening to several rhythm and tap along the beat. Third, melody discrimination. By listening to 2 music contour, you judge whether the 2 are the same or different. Fourth, environmental sounds identification. This is the open-set 10 environmental sounds identification. Fifth, preference to harmony. This is based on a past experiment that showed hearing people preferred the music where melody and accompaniment are played in the same tune, while hearing impaired people did not. and a simple easy game of music puzzle. Altogether, executing 6 tests took about 30 minutes. Participants decided the order of the tests. This table shows how the 2 participants played music puzzle. Number of games shows that P1 played less games in the final week, while P2 struggled the play. Time to spend for a game shows that P1 took more time in complete a game than the success rate of the 2 participants. P2 had difficulties in playing games in the later weeks. The graph shows the success rate in the vertical bar and the correction in the horizontal bar by each of the material type by 2 participants. Solid line shows the rates by P1 and dashed lines by P2. Blue color shows the instrumental music, orange the reading, and gray the mix. P2 could play with music but not reading nor mix. First, the result about dictation. This graph shows the rate of correct syllables in vertical bar and the time in the horizontal bar of dictation by P1. Blue line shows the success rate for the reading by a male, and the orange line shows the success rate for the reading by a female. We are not so sure he could get better rate by experience or remembrance. Probably we should try it with a different reading. P1 also showed the progress in beat recognition, but no effect in the rest of the test for both P1 and P2. The graph shows the success rate of environmental sound identification by the 2 participants. The blue line shows the success rate by P1 and the orange line by P2. This shows the free description after the experiment by the 2 participants. P1 said the concentration in playing music puzzle is reducing in the final week. The increased number of sound objects made him feel that music puzzle was difficult. We do not know whether because he lost concentration the MP got difficult, or because music puzzle was difficult, he lost his concentration. P2 is a positive student. In spite of her struggle with the music puzzle experiment, she felt she could get sounds better. She noticed that the difficulty level increased and not get beat. Now the discussion. We used 6 types of tests ranging from speech, environmental sounds, to music with a holistic approach to sound recognition. As a result, we could not show the effectiveness of the 4-week training with music puzzle by the assessment. There is a clinical test for music perception like appreciation of music in cochlear implantees. We may try it for music appreciation, but currently there is no perfect assessment for judging the training and its effects. With the 4-week 10-hour training gets no specific effects. Probably the longer training will lead to better results. On the other hand, we have to understand there could be other factors or experiences for the results than the training. Difficulty setting is difficult, but we can say the selection of material is important. Appropriate sound material and reasonable difficulty progression are very important. That's we can say now. Our future work will be using music puzzle as a starting point. We are going to make a fun music training for deaf and hard of hearing people. Since the hearing ability of and the preference to music by deaf and hard of hearing people varies widely, participants will be able to choose sound material by themselves in the future game. Also provide adaptive difficulty level is desirable. This is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Adrián and I'm here to present our work titled Exploring Emotion Perception in Sonic HRI or Human-Robot Interactions, along with my colleagues, Claudio Panariello, who will also presenting today with me, and Roberto Bresin. We are from KTH in Sweden. This study is part of a larger project called SONAO, which aims to improve the comprehensibility of robot nonverbal communications. As we all understand that the robot has a very limited movement with a very limited degree of freedoms in their joints and their motors. Thus, the communications or expressions of emotion and intention is very limited. And we aim to use the sonifications of the movement to help improve those communication. As a background, the interaction between human and robot takes place in multimodal interactions with visual aspect of it and the sound aspect of it. And a poorly designed interaction might introduce undesirable effects. For example, when the sound does not match the appearance, or when the sound does not match the movements, then the communications might be ineffective. Two common ways that's been used mainly in the HRI, in the field of human-robot interactions, are the first one is to use recorded sound. So for example, one study, they use a sound of dog growling to communicate the intentions of the robot being angry. And another strategy is to use tone patterns. For example, this one study here, they describe the sound that they use for joy as a high-pitched sound with longer interbeeps intervals. And another study used beep sounds with upward slopes to communicate disagreement. We think that this is due to the limitations of the background of the researchers in HRI being not from sound or music background. And we would like to introduce a more complex and more richer, or like a richer sound to help improve the communication. And the aim of this study is to find sound models suitable for the communications of expressive movements made by humanoid robots.
We carried out an online perceptual rating experiment in which we proposed stimuli containing sound in three different versions: only original sounds produced by the robot itself, a first set of simple sounds based on sawtooth, a second set of more complex sounds based on feedback chains. The robot movements are adapted from the emotional postures defined by Arun in order to perform gestures related to four emotions: sadness, excitement, anger, and relaxation. Regarding the sounds, original robot sounds are the sounds produced by Pepper's 20 servomotors while performing an emotional gesture. Here we have an example of the sound produced by robot by Pepper performing a gesture to communicate excitement. Then we synthesized two different sound sets. Both sounds were generated following a score created from temporal marks in the video in correspondence of the robot gesture. So the synthesized sounds were created accordingly to that score, recorded, and then superimposed to the videos. The first sound synthesis method is a very simple and is based on filtered sawtooth. The choice of parameters was informed by the characteristic values of musical variables used in the communication of emotions in music performances, as reported in Emotion Rendering in Music by Bresin and Friber. So, for example, for communicating excitement, it was chosen an overall pitch that was higher than the one chosen from, for example, communicate sadness. In this case, we have an example of the excitement gesture. The sawtooth was then overlapped to the original robot sound. The second sound synthesis was more complex and based on feedback chains. This synthesis was chosen because it has been previously developed with a clear aesthetical aim and not in order to fulfill a specific functionality. Also here, similar consideration for generating sounds were applied, adjusting the parameters according to the need of this synthesis method. Here, so we have an example of the sound for the excitement gesture with the second sound synthesis. And again, the sound overlapped to the original robot sound. In our online perceptual rating experiment, we had a total of 17 participants, most of them regarding themselves as semi-professional or music experts. They were asked to rate 3 kinds of stimuli: audio only, audio video, and video only. And we asked the participants to rate the stimuli on 4 emotional scales and to rate the following statements: how pleasant is the gesture, how do you like the gesture, how typical is the sound coming from the robot, how efficient is the sound in communicating emotion, and how much do you trust the robot.
Next, I will present some highlights from our results. You can see here on the screen is the perceptions rating from our participants when being shown the video or stimuli of pepper robot being excited. Here you can see on the screens our results from different types of stimuli. The first one, V, here is when the stimuli is video only without sound. S1, S2, and S3 are when the stimuli was sound only, so sound 1, sound 2, and sound 3. VS1, VS2, and VS3 are when the stimuli are both audio and visual. Different colors are the rating for different emotions given by the participants for the same video. And you can see here in this video, in this stimuli, that in most cases, excited are being rated as the highest emotion being perceived by the participants. The most interesting part here is that when the participant listened to only sound 1, meaning the recorded sound, the excited was not as strong as when it is with S2 or S3. So we can say that the additional synthesized sound helped the recognitions of the excited stimuli. This will be helpful, for example, when a robot is present around a human without being seen, then having an extra additional synthesized sound will help the communications of the emotions. We can also see that VS1, VS2, and VS3 gave a high rating results, which shows the effect of the visual aspect of the stimuli. Here are the stimuli presented to the participants. The first one is the recorded audio and video. The second one is the same recorded audio and video with the second sound, the sound number 2, layered on top of it. And the third one is the same recorded sound and video with sound number 3 layered on top of it. Next highlight is on the recognitions of sad. we find that S2 affects the recognitions of sad emotion better than S3. As you can see, with video only, it's quite clear that Pepper was showing sad emotions, but having an S3 layered on top of it gave some confusions that the robot was being relaxed instead of being sad, while S2 are still clearly marked as sad. And here are the stimuli. This is the recorded audio and video. And this is the same recorded audio and video with sound number 2 layered on top of it. And this is the last one, the audio and video with sound number 3 layered on top of the recorded sound. Okay, so in conclusions, S2 helped more with the sad instead of S number 3. Those are the highlights of the recognitions of emotions. We would also like to present highlights from the behavior of the participants. We aggregated the responses for all emotions, but only looked at the video audio stimuli, so with both sound and visual aspect. We found that S3 is rated more typical and likable than S2, while still on the same level as typicality and likelihood of S number 1, sound 1. It means that for our participants, they deemed that the S3 is more likable to be put on a robot, and S3 is more typical of a robot, similar to the motor sound compared to sawtooth or rather simpler sound. So to recap, this is a pilot study of a larger project, and we plan to expand to add more participants. And we also plan to focus on viewer characteristics. So based from the current study, we find that typicality and likability are two of the more important characteristics of human behavior in HRI and human-robot interactions. And we also plan to add the real-time sonifications of humanoid robot gestures. So instead of adding the sound later on a video, we would like to put the sound models in the robot directly, so we can have a real-time sonifications of the movements to better communicate the intention and the emotions of the robot. And that concludes our presentations, and thank you for listening.
So, hello, greetings from Thessaloniki. I'm Asterios Zacharakis from the Aristotle University. I would like to thank all the authors for presenting their fine work. I can assume that producing pre-recorded videos should be a laborious task, not to mention producing the research itself. So I would like to start by the order of presentation. So I would like to start asking the first question to Sven-Amin. So I have some questions about, the first question was about how did you rate musicianship level? And may I add, if you think that because you had different categories of musicianship in your panel, do you think that if you tested if you had a larger panel, that different levels of expertise in music would account for different answers, different responses? So I'd like to start by...
Okay, so I guess I'm live, and there might be a delay. Well, first of all, thanks for the question, Asterios. So this is a question I think I saw on YouTube aimed at me from Raris, or posed to me from Raris. And so musicianship, first of all, wasn't meant as between subjects variable. So we didn't actually recruit separate groups of equal order, but then there was kind of a mix. And I did want to have a look at in what ways musicianship could have been relevant here. And musicianship was measured based on self-reported years of training in related disciplines such as instrumental practice, composition, ear training, music theory, but sometimes even including audio engineering practice, because that will also develop listening expertise. And I, just out of interest, also had a look at trying to correlate that against perception of tempo gestures, loudness gestures, and the pitch gestures. Although there's a trend for increasing listening expertise to improve accuracy also in the experiment, it wasn't that clear, really. I think the highest correlation we obtained was about 0.6. So yeah, that hopefully will answer your question.
Okay, so and I'm also wondering about the consistency of your responses. So, and also how maybe you have asked your participants how hard they found the task. Was it difficult for them? And on top of that, I'm combining another question. Have you maybe considered, or maybe you consider for the future, to just freely ask participants to draw a trajectory rather than just give them, the template to play with and change linearity to exponential and logarithmic shapes?
Okay, yeah, I spotted those questions as well. So thank you for those who raised them on YouTube. First of all, the first question was relative to how difficult they found the task. I know from just anecdotal evidence, talking to participants afterwards, that the tempo gestures were the hardest really to perceive differences between and also relate them to the visual trajectories. And that's, I think, quite clearly reflected in just the weak and inconsistent findings we obtained for that type of gesture. But then for pitch gestures and loudness gestures, although participants did complain that it was a bit difficult, the data is quite reliable. We didn't have exact repetitions of the same condition, but then the repetitions we can look at are the same functions across the different contexts that were tested. And since there were no contextual effects for pitch and also loudness gestures, I think they were fairly reliable and also very strong in terms of the measured effect sizes. And to the second question on whether drawing in response to sounds would have actually allowed listeners to express their perceptions even more clearly in an embodied way, that would have ideally actually been my starting point, but I've so far been reluctant to take that avenue because I'm quite scared of how to analyze that data in the end. So I'm still keeping it in the back of my head to maybe employ some form of machine learning, computer vision approaches to actually then look at those sketches, because you're just leaving too many degrees of freedom and variables open, and that might just make the data analysis a nightmare. So I just wanted as much control as possible.
Okay, makes sense. And one final question for you, Sven. So what do you think these pitch and loudness trajectories can tell us about the interaction between the two sound attributes? And the third one, timbre.
The interaction. I don't think this experiment will tell us much at all because they were all tested in isolation. I know that in research on sound gestures, there indeed have been concurrent variations across different parameters. Known some to be more dominant than others. For example, I think pitch is more dominant compared to some other parameters. When in motion capture studies, participants are asked to kind of accompany the sound they're listening to by corresponding gestures. That oftentimes the most dominant auditory parameter would then be used for gestural expression in that case. So I'm afraid that I can't add much more, or the experimental data that I have won't really shed any light on that.
Okay, Sven, thanks for your answers and thanks for your talk. It was very interesting.
You're welcome.
We now have
Thanks to everyone for the questions too. Very helpful and valuable.
And I think we can move on to the second presentation. So I'd like to ask Alfred the first question. This study serves as a proof of concept that gestural shape or for tempo gestures may be perceived as Sven and convey some meaning. I would like to ask, I think one of my own questions this would be, fear and anger, you found them to be confused, right? In your sound stimuli, is that right? Did I get this right?
Correct, yeah.
So what does the literature say about other types of stimuli, for example, like speech or music? Are they also confused does this agree with the literature?
For sure here. I know that in one of the studies we reference, they found that they had similar acoustic cues, fear and anger, but I don't think they ran like an identification test for people to see this. But there is some indication, at least. That's all I know. And what was the first question again?
One other question would be that Pollock and Patterson investigated perception of knocking but from motion and found velocity to be important. I think Sophia Dahl may have asked this question, who's doing most of the hard work, asking a lot of questions. So she's asking, do you know this? And if so, how would you say your results compare to that?
Well, yeah, I was not aware of this study, so I can't say how the results compare. But we looked at other studies that include both emotions and motion. So there's, for instance, one by Gross and others, which showed that negative and positive emotions can be recognized in knocking movement. But that's all I'm aware of, since we, in our scope, we kept it just for the listening part. So there is certainly scope for more multimodal interactions going forward, and yeah, I think like eventually in applied settings this will be part of more multimodal contexts. So it's certainly worth exploring in the future.
Okay, and what about the material of the door? Would you think that if you compared a wooden and a metallic door, for example, would help to convey emotion in a better way, in a sense of tonal versus noise ratio could become relevant?
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. I mean, if you have a very flappy kind of door, it could render more, similar knocking patterns, even though you strike it in different ways. And yeah, again, like this contextual information seems like it can have a lot of effect on this particular area. So, I mean, right now in the listening test, our participants had no contextual information whatsoever, but in real life, of course, we always, there's always some contextual factors that can help us interpret their results, and those would be worth looking into.
Okay. Well, thanks for your answers. I think we need to move fast to the third presenter. Thanks for your talk as well.
Thank
interesting
you.
stuff. So I will proceed to Rumi and ask with a question about whether the participants had acquired impairments, hearing impairments early or late in life, and also whether the puzzle game is available publicly.
Yeah, about the participant, the P1 got lost his hearing in his teens, so it means he lost his hearing later after he got his language ability. But P2, she lost her hearing at the age of 3, I think.
Okay.
So that's the answer for that question, I think.
And what about the availability of the puzzle game?
That's from Soviet.
Yeah, I can answer that. I don't know if you can see me now, but maybe do like that. It is kind of available. It's not a secret or anything, but it's written for a very early version of several years. But hopefully now we can, with these new findings, we can produce a better game for air training. And now we will actually use Web Audio XML, which is developed by Hans Lindetorp, and that one will be online instead of developed for one platform. So it will be much more convenient in every sense. So while you can get it, I would I will say that we can wait a bit, and then we will have it in a web format instead.
Okay. So one question of my own to Rumi. I noticed that you haven't used any kind of control group in your experiment. I would have expected to do the same, a similar task with, but with not using the game puzzle. So people may just listen to music instead of just trying to do something and to just to resegment the desegmented parts. So do you plan to do that in the future to show in a more rigorous way whether indeed that puzzle game has effects in increasing the hearing ability of the participants or the people that do that?
During your question, the connection is lost, and I cannot completely listen to your question.
No, I can answer a bit on that. And earlier studies we done had been with control groups, and this time we just wanted to see what kind of result from long time training with very few participants, that we had much more control, so we can do the test and just see if those participants could develop and train their hearing, and if they couldn't, then there would be less to go on from. So yes, it would be good to have a control group, but we had that in previous studies, and now we had a different aim.
Okay. So thanks very much. Thanks for your talk. We need to move fast because we have only a few minutes left to the final presenter. Thank you again for your interesting talk. And so, is it Adrián? Do I get it right?
And Claudio.
Claudio's here. We're both. So, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering, where could I buy that robot, and if it does any interesting jobs at home so that I could use. Anyway, I wanted to ask whether you tested for significance between conditions. For example, I notice here that for the excited stimuli, only the visual response were already very excited, were rated to be very excited. And actually, the superimposition of the sounds decreased that response even a little bit. So have you tested if in other situations between your conditions, the superimposition of the sound actually added something to our visual?
Okay, we did, for the participants, we showed first only the video and then only the sound, and then finally both sound and video. And we do test the significance between each of the modality. And for some cases, there are some significance, but I think in particular for that sound, for the excitement, video or the visual aspect plays like a bigger role on the perception or on the recognitions of that emotions. So to answer the questions, yes, we do have a significant follow-up significant studies on the responses, and it's presented in the paper.
Okay, so how do you explain the fact that in the excited then case, the excitement drops a little bit when it's matched with the sound compared to the visual?
Yeah, this might be related for one side, for example, to some kind of intrinsic quality of the sawtooth sound that is like itself considered like sad, so it's like compensating in a negative way just the visual aspect. So this might be related to this.
Okay. I think, unfortunately, we need to end it here because our time is up. I'd like to once again thank all of the participants, all of the authors and the speakers for presenting their work. I really enjoyed that. I had hoped that I could meet you in person in Torino, but let's leave it for next time, hopefully after this virus is over. Thanks a lot again. I would like you to join me to virtually clap all the contributions and to wish you a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.